Good morning. I am here today in West Texas at the mouth of the opening to the Permian Basin, which is the largest oil-producing spot on the planet. Even more production per capita than Saudi Arabia. And there's a lot of very fascinating elements of West Texas, of the power structure here that projects outward across America and across the rest of the world, that I think a lot of folks would benefit from hearing about. It's been a subject of fascination for me for many years, and I think it will be for you too. So I'll start with an anecdote here. Senator Ted Cruz is a Republican senator in the state of Texas, and last year he had put between 35 and 65 congressional picks from the Biden administration on hold, refusing to ratify them in the Senate to have Senate-confirmed positions until sanctions were put back on the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, these were over totally random picks, FTC, education, intelligence, national security, labor, all of these picks. And he traded it all for a floor vote on putting sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline. So this is a prominent politician who cares about the culture wars, who talked a big talk, and in the end, he traded it all for a vote on a oil pipeline that was 5,000 miles away from his home state with his home constituents. How can you explain this without understanding the geopolitics of West Texas? So let's take a step back and transport back in time to the 1960s. In 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, there were many parapolitical researchers who tried to make sense of American power structures and how this could have happened, how there could have been this supposed CIA involvement in the story, the role of everything from anti-Castro Cubans to energy politics to military-industrial complex. And there was a writer and researcher named Peter Dale Scott who penned a book and a sort of framework theory called the Yankee Cowboy War. And this was this idea that you had basically two power centers in the United States. One of them he called the Yankees, which were primarily northeast corridor, the sort of Boston, New York, Philly, DC, that sort of classic northeast power structure that prominently had financial and corporate assets as its power center, as well as transatlantic relations with the City of London. And that's that sort of New York crowd that conservatives tend to bemoan as being a central power broker in DC politics. The other one he coined was the cowboy faction, primarily at the time in California and Texas. At that time, California was a red state. And this is before the military-industrial complex moved from Northern California to Arlington, Virginia, when the Reagan era started, and the military contractors all moved from the West Coast to the East. And these two power centers primarily concerned the military-industrial complex, which at the time was primarily right-wing Republican, centered around the sort of anti-communist CIA capacities and all the culture war proclivities of that. And the energy mafia around, centered primarily from Houston, Texas, out into the western parts of the state. And the role of Texas there was it was the seat of American oil wealth, which is a huge part of how America's power projected itself in the 20th century, from Rockefeller and Standard Oil into Chevron and Exxon and everything else. Much of what we call the Uniparty can be understood as an alliance between the city of New York, if you will, with its finance capital, and the city of Houston with its energy capital. This is a huge amount of how the U.S. does power projection abroad, and is a big part of the story of the war in Ukraine. It is Halliburton the company of which Dick Cheney was the chairman for many years, which has the oil processing rights to all the shale reserves east of the Dnieper River in Ukraine. It is Chevron, which had a partnership with Naftogaz in Ukraine, a profit-sharing partnership, in order to ship West Texas oil to liquefy the gas. This is LNG. You liquefy the gas, you ship it in containers across the Atlantic Ocean, and then you connect it to ports in Portugal or in Spain or in Poland now to use the gas pipeline infrastructure that was created originally to carry Gazprom oil into Europe. So the idea is you had Houston GOP folks who were going to be making a 7 to 8x markup on selling American gas from West Texas to Europe rather than Russian gas in a natural gas pipeline from Russia into there. And so there was a huge profit motive of the major U.S. oil and gas companies centered out of West Texas, at least that's where the supply came from, to run this op around Nord Stream in order to profit from a geopolitical maneuver powered by the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the intelligence community. Which gets to the role of these power brokers and their deep connections, and why it is that you can have a president like Trump arrested, but you bet your bottom dollar they wouldn't arrest a Bush. And this is because populists don't have a mafia in this country. The Yankees have a mafia. They've got money. They've got centuries of power, having and in institutional capacities being built up. You've got and the Cowboys have a mafia. Populists do not. It's important to remember that when Trump won the 2016 election, he didn't just defeat the Clinton dynasty. He defeated the Bush dynasty. He defeated both New York and Texas. And as a result, he found himself a man without protection. And this is sort of the origins of mafias in the first place. They sort of start off as a protection racket, first for protection from some outside force. You sign up with the mafia so that you can be protected against rival gangs. And then, as the mafia becomes more and more corrupt, you need protection from them. But what's happened in this country is you have this uniparty mafia, but populists, both from the Trump right and the JFK and the RFK left, have no mafia with which to defend themselves from. And as we've seen in the state of Texas, the state attorney general, Ken Paxton, was impeached by his own Republican state assembly when he went too hard challenging the Biden regime. And part of this is because in Texas politics, there is a payoff for running the Biden foreign policy plan, especially around Ukraine and Russia, as opposed to the Trump plan, which would basically destroy a long-running profit plan to ship LNG and export it at massively marked up prices around the world, but primarily using that portal of Eastern Europe and then leveraging all of the existing gas pipeline infrastructure into Germany and into Western Europe from there. So as a final closing note here, consider some of the origins of GOP power. George H.W. Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency before he became Ronald Reagan's vice president. His power base was in the oil field. Before he became CIA director, he was a CIA liaison to the oil intelligence world, including having started an oil company, Zapata Oil, right there in the heart of the Medellin cartel in Colombia, and continued to maintain very close relationships with the Colombian foreign affairs folks, as well as in Mexico, which was a huge part of sourcing Texan oil That is, they draw supplies through partnerships in Colombia and Mexico, and also to the north in Canada, and also across the Middle East. But you had George H.W. Bush, whose power came from the oil mafia. You had Dick Cheney, whose power came from the oil and gas mafia. And even the number one contender in the 2016 election on the Republican side was Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, who traded all of his domestic culture war and domestic priority leverage for a floor vote on a foreign policy issue of concern to the oil and gas industry in Texas. So, you know, where are we now is, what do you do when you're up against a mafia on the left and a mafia on the right, and all you want is what's good for the average middle-class American family? How do you do this without creating a state-powered political structure? You know, is that something that could be connected with the state of Florida, for example, or with other red states? That was sort of one of the draws of a Ron DeSantis figure, although it remains to be seen now after this brass-knuckled primaries season, whether something like that will hold, and where DeSantis falls on that Texas foreign policy worldview versus caring about primarily what's going on in the American homeland.